There are names that survived when almost nothing else did. No crown. No written law. No unbroken kingdom. Just a name passed from father to son, across 1,000 years of invasion, famine, and exile. And somewhere inside that name, encoded in a molecule too small to see, a signal may still be waiting. For centuries, a surname was just a word. A label stitched onto a family by a priest, a landlord, or a clerk who needed something to write in a ledger. That was the accepted story. Names were administrative. Names were convenient. Names were not supposed to mean anything deeper than paperwork. Then genetics entered the room, and some of these rare Celtic surnames stopped looking like paperwork. They started looking like fossils. This is the story of 13 surnames, some nearly extinct, some clinging to a single valley or a single island, and what happened when researchers began asking a question genealogists had avoided for generations. Can a name actually carry a bloodline? The answer is not simple. It is not clean. But it may be one of the strangest intersections of culture and biology that modern science has stumbled into. For most of history, the link between surname and ancestry was assumed rather than tested. In the Celtic-speaking regions of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and the Isle of Man, surnames often emerged from a single founder, a chieftain, a warlord, a monastic dynasty, whose descendants took his name as a badge of belonging. A surname like a clan name was not just an identifier. It was a claim. It said, "We descend from this man. We belong to this line." Historians accepted this as cultural fact. Genealogists built family trees on it. And for a long time, that was enough. The names were old, the oral traditions were strong, and nobody had a way to actually check whether the biology matched the story. That is where the first crack appeared. Population geneticists studying the British Isles noticed something odd in the early surname DNA pilot studies. When they tested unrelated men who happened to share a rare surname, they expected scattered, unrelated genetic backgrounds. After all, surnames had been reassigned, anglicized, and adopted by unrelated families for centuries. Instead, for a subset of rare surnames, an unusually large proportion of men shared the same Y chromosome lineage. Not similar. The same. That should not happen by chance. Not for a surname carried by only a few hundred living men. This is where the science had to get precise, and where the story stopped being folklore and started being forensic. The Y chromosome passes from father to son almost unchanged, generation after generation, with only slow, predictable mutations accumulating over time, much like a surname itself. That parallel is what makes Y DNA the natural partner to patrilineal surnames. If a name was founded by one man 1,000 years ago, and if that name was reliably passed down the male line without interruption, then in theory, his male line descendants today should still carry a recognizably related Y chromosome signature. In theory. Reality, as always, complicated things. Researchers began comparing men who shared rare Celtic surnames against large databases of Y chromosome haplogroups, the deep genetic branches that trace paternal ancestry back thousands of years. What they found was not one clean story. It was several, layered on top of each other, some confirming old legends and some quietly undermining them. A useful seed moment sits naturally here. If the tangled relationship between names, clans, and DNA fascinates you, subscribe, because the human past hides itself in far stranger places than most people expect, including the words we use for ourselves. For some rare surnames, the genetic match was extraordinary. Independent, unrelated men bearing the same uncommon name were found to share a rare Y DNA signature at rates far above random chance, consistent with descent from a single founding male centuries earlier. In several of these cases, researchers noted that the shared genetic marker aligned with lineages associated with early medieval Irish and Scottish dynastic families, the kind of families whose descendants were once said, in oral tradition, to have seeded entire regions with their bloodline. For other surnames, the picture fractured. Multiple, genetically distinct paternal lineages were found sharing the exact same name, evidence not of one bloodline, but of several unrelated families who had, at different points in history, adopted or been assigned the same surname. Sometimes this happened through fosterage, a Celtic practice in which children were raised by families other than their birth parents, sometimes through illegitimacy that was quietly folded into the family record, sometimes through simple administrative convenience, when English-speaking officials imposed a single anglicized spelling onto several unrelated Gaelic names that merely sounded alike. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. It meant the surname itself was not one story, but a container that had absorbed multiple stories over centuries. 3 explanatory frameworks began to emerge from this tangle, and no single one fully accounts for what the DNA shows. The first is the founder effect model, a name born from one man, defended fiercely enough by his descendants that it stayed almost genetically pure, protected by geographic isolation on a remote peninsula, island, or highland valley where outsiders rarely settled and rarely married in. The second is the multiple origin model, a name that sounds unified today but was, in truth, independently created or adopted by several unrelated lineages, perhaps because it described an occupation, a physical trait, or a place rather than a specific ancestor, meaning son of the smith, or man from the loch, could arise again and again in different families. The third, and the most unsettling for genealogists, is the non-paternity model, a name whose biological thread was broken at some point by adoption, fosterage, or an unrecorded event, meaning the cultural inheritance of the name continued unbroken even while the genetic inheritance quietly diverged. Each rare surname tested seems to fall somewhere on this spectrum, and researchers remain cautious about assuming which explanation applies without direct testing, because the documentary record, birth, marriage, and parish registers often cannot resolve what actually happened in a household 8 or 10 generations ago. The landmark studies that reshaped this field were not single dramatic discoveries but a slow accumulation of surname-based Y chromosome surveys conducted across Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, comparing large panels of men against historical genealogical records. What made these studies matter was scale and precision, larger sample sizes, better resolved haplogroup markers, and comparison against ancient DNA recovered from early medieval burial sites, which allowed researchers to check whether living bloodlines actually traced back toward the deep past their oral traditions claimed, or toward something else entirely. And this is where the real twist appears. In several of the most striking cases, researchers did not find what the legends predicted. A surname tradition might insist on descent from a particular royal or ecclesiastical dynasty rooted in one region, yet the dominant Y chromosome signature carried by the name pointed toward a haplogroup more strongly associated with a different, often older, population layer altogether. Not disproof, exactly. Genetic evidence of this kind rarely proves a negative, but a complication, a signal that did not fit the tidy version of the story. In some cases, that older layer traced back toward pre-Celtic populations, the farmers and hunter-gatherers who inhabited the British Isles thousands of years before Celtic language and culture arrived. In other words, some names that sound, feel, and function as unmistakably Celtic may be carried, biologically, by paternal lines considerably older than the Celtic identity itself. The culture was inherited. The name was inherited. But underneath both, the deepest genetic thread may stretch back to a population that existed before Celtic meant anything at all. Not the ancestry researchers expected. Not even the era they expected. The surname was not erasing the older story. It was preserving it, wrapped inside a much younger cultural label. This matters beyond 13 rare names on a list. It suggests that surnames function less like genetic certificates and more like sediment, layer after layer of human movement, adoption, conquest, and quiet reinvention, compressed into a single inherited word. A name can be Celtic in language and identity while carrying a Y chromosome lineage older than the Celts. A name can look unified on paper while representing 3 or 4 unrelated founding fathers. A name can survive extinction by a single surviving male line, clinging on through famine, emigration, and war, while the men who carry it today live scattered from Donegal to Nova Scotia to Melbourne, unaware they are among the last living carriers of a genetic thread that predates recorded history. Picture the landscape where several of these rare names still cluster today. A narrow peninsula on the Atlantic edge of Ireland, where the wind comes in off open ocean with nothing to slow it for 3,000 miles. Dry stone walls run along the fields like veins, built by hands that have been dust for centuries. In the old graveyards, the same handful of surnames repeat on stone after stone, generations stacked on generation, the letters softened by rain and lichen. Somewhere beneath that ground, and somewhere still moving in the blood of the men walking above it, a Y chromosome lineage persists, indifferent to empire, to famine ships, to the English clerks who once tried to standardize the spelling of a name that had existed long before spelling mattered at all. If you have a rare surname in your own family, and you have ever wondered whether it holds more than sentiment, this is exactly the kind of question genetics is only beginning to answer. And if that kind of mystery interests you, let me know in the comments which surname or bloodline you think deserves this treatment next. What the DNA evidence ultimately offers is not a verdict. It is a reframing. The old assumption, that a surname is simply a name, arbitrary and administrative, turns out to be too small. So does the opposite assumption, the romantic one, that every rare surname preserves an unbroken bloodline stretching back to a single legendary founder. The truth, as usual, sits in the harder, more interesting middle ground. Some names really do preserve extraordinary genetic continuity across 1,000 years or more. Others are composite structures, built from multiple unrelated families who converged, by chance or circumstance, on the same word. And a few, remarkably, appear to carry genetic signatures older than the very culture the name claims to represent. None of this diminishes the people who carry these names today. If anything, it deepens what the name means. A surname was never only a marker of one bloodline standing alone through history. It was a vessel, sometimes accurate, sometimes symbolic, always human, for something people needed to say about who they were and where they came from, at a time when written records could disappear and oral memory was the only archive available. The genome does not replace that memory. It complicates it, tests it, and occasionally confirms it in ways that feel almost impossible. A fatherline signal, quietly persisting across 40 or 50 generations, still detectable in a mouth swab taken in a kitchen in modern Donegal or Cape Breton or Sydney. The map of who belongs to whom, biologically and culturally, is still being drawn. Every rare surname tested adds one more data point to a picture that keeps resisting simplicity. What began as a question about paperwork, is this just an old family name or something more, has become a genuine scientific frontier, sitting exactly where history, culture, and biology refuse to separate cleanly. The names survived. What they actually carried inside them all this time is still being discovered.